Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. One of the few historical laws that historians consider as always true is that a dictatorship always follows a long period of anarchy. Always. If, nowadays, our world has become extremely unstable, it is mainly because of all the shortages created by the overconsumption of almost 8 billion people. Not only are we too many on the planet, but our desire to consume has literally no limits. Just to impress their neighbors, millions of people keep buying houses far too large for their needs. Millionaires build useless collections of luxury cars. Billionaires spend fortunes to acquire larger yachts than their friends. And it is well known that kings and nobles always wasted without counting to build gigantic castles. If we are so many, it's because during 12,000 years, poor people were able to multiply freely by replacing savannas and forests with cultivated fields located in low-lying plains or on artificial terraces built in mountains. Despite the fact that in the process many natural species became extinct, the environmental situation was still tolerable on the planet since farmers did not consume very much. That would change with the Industrial Revolution, which in less than 2 centuries allowed billions of people to move in large cities where they lost contact with the natural world. This is when mankind started to produce and consume as if there were no limits to its economic growth. As a result, buffaloes almost disappeared from the North American prairies. The oceans soon became overexploited. The Aral Sea in Central Asia became a desert due to the diversion of its water to produce cotton. Gigantic open-pit mines were exploited without taking into consideration the pollution produced. And we waged industrial wars that made large territories unusable for agriculture, 3 million hectares only for the First World War. These days, the environmental crisis is so acute that we can find examples of extreme pollution in almost every single country. As I explained in the other videos of this series, the exponential growth of our industrial economies is not viable, especially if we take into account the very rapid collapse of the natural environments which must absorb all our pollution without any help. For many essential natural resources, we have already reached what the economists call the Hubbard peak, which is the point where the total quantity of a given resources extracted on the planet starts to decrease. It's already obvious in the case of water, the most important raw material used by mankind in volume. Unfortunately, our superior classes have been living in industrial cities for generations and always had very little contact with the natural world, except maybe during the holidays they spent in the most beautiful and protected areas of the world. No wonder they don't believe the planet is sick. It also explains why they all want more industrial growth. It's important to remember here that the economic theories our leaders learned at school were all the products of the industrial world. For instance, the ideologies behind capitalism and communism have all been developed by thinkers who studied the Industrial Revolution without considering the environmental damages it created. In 1776, Adam Smith, who was intellectually honest, had explained how capitalism was working and how it would correct by itself the most obvious injustices it created. In the 19th century, Karl Marx responded to Adam Smith with an in-depth analysis of the brutal consequences of the capitalist mentality. For instance, by describing the disguised forms of slavery imposed to workers and even to children by greedy capitalists. Unfortunately, since Karl Marx wanted to destroy capitalism and the capitalists themselves through a violent revolution, he voluntarily lied about the positive aspects of capitalism. For him, profit was never the product of hard work, but always the result of stealing. For Marx, the creation, the organization, and the cost reduction efforts done by the founder of an enterprise was worthless, as well as the technological revolutions launched by brilliant inventors like James Watt or Thomas Edison. According to Marx, 1 hour of work done by the laziest worker was worth as much as 1 hour of work done by the most meticulous person, etc., etc. Since Karl Marx wrote almost nothing about the organization of a communist society, the first Bolsheviks who took the power in underdeveloped countries imposed a brutal dictatorship to make sure that nobody would threaten the edification of socialism. In particular, they didn't organize the separation of powers, which, in a civilized society, protects the ordinary citizens against an abuse of power. For the Bolsheviks, all the problems and all opposition had to be eliminated by using violence. It's worth mentioning here that the far left and the far right are not at all the two extremities of the political spectrum, since they have the same origin, the same mentality, and the same hatred for democratic values. Benito Mussolini, for example, created fascism only 5 years after leaving the Italian Socialist Party, while National Socialism was in fact a form of socialism which also fought against capitalism, but against the Jewish capitalism. Moreover, fascism and communism were both using the same methods of government: stealing, terror, torture, murders, deportations, concentration camps, mass slavery, etc. Contrary to the Nazis, the communists have been lucky enough to win almost all their wars, which gave them enough time to erase the traces of their most shocking crimes against humanity. This is why, even today, they keep presenting themselves as the future of mankind. For decades, they refused to admit the obvious failure of their ideology, especially when its achievements were compared with the spectacular capitalist and democratic success of a vanquished country like Japan. The communists were so sure they were right that till the end they forced the nations under their control to waste a lot of resources to produce goods nobody wanted to buy, goods that were simply piling up on the shelves of their state-owned stores. Something interesting, when they realized they were unable to create the workers' paradise they had envisioned, the communists came to the conclusion that they had not used enough violence. With the passing of time, their brutality kept increasing. The mass killings of Lenin and Stalin between 1917 and 1953 were followed by the carnage caused by the most delirious economic project of Mao Zedong in China, and, finally, by the Cambodian genocide of the 1970s, when the Khmer Rouge exterminated 1/4 of their own people. They even targeted the most educated part of the population. It is only when the nations under their control became too exhausted to support it any longer that the whole system collapsed during the 1980s. Almost without any transition, communism was then replaced by the most unbridled capitalism, which did enrich the population, but without respecting its human rights or its natural environments. In the long battle between communism and capitalism, or if you want, between the right and the left, the interests of the working classes have always been sacrificed, despite the fact that those intellectual quarrels were opposing two different factions of the upper classes. It's only after the spectacular economic growth that followed the collapse of communism that some members of the ruling classes understood that mankind was destroying the natural environments that made its survival possible. At the beginning of the 21st century, politicians all over the world realized that the traditional recipes to jumpstart the economy no longer work, nowhere. The only result they get when they print money like crazy, or when they create mountains of debts, is to inflate real estate and stock exchange bubbles that have almost no effect on the real brick and mortar economy. Now that their coffers are almost empty, the world's leader recently decided to create, with the help of the mass media, an artificial panic around the coronavirus pandemic, even if they know it is almost over, and that even if there were 5 different waves of COVID-19, much more than 99.5% of the world population would survive. It's easy to calculate. In August 2020, only 800,000 people had died of the coronavirus out of a global population of 7.8 billion people, which is a ridiculous 0.01% of the world population. As usual, you can verify everything I say by using the internet bibliography I will put at the end of the video and in the description placed under the video on the internet. When all the frightened people we see around us will finally come back on planet Earth, they will realize that the lockdown imposed to half of the world population will force millions of enterprises into bankruptcy, which will create an economic depression much deeper than the depression of the 1930s. It's obvious that all the propaganda on the COVID-19 pandemic has a clear purpose: to create a scapegoat for the coming depression. Our politicians need that scapegoat, since they know they lost control over the world economy. We can summarize the present situation by saying that due to the acceleration of history, we no longer have enough time to find solutions to our problems. Our natural environments, which are in rapid decline, will also prevent us from finding those solutions soon enough. Anyway, our problems are so complex that nobody knows what those solutions could be, especially our political leaders. We also don't have the money to finance those solutions. It has been wasted by our governments. Politically speaking, the planet is not organized to solve its global problems. People like Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, or Justin Trudeau are clearly overwhelmed by the sheer size of the problems. Finally, there is the fact that human beings love the consumer societies they built and will try to rebuild them as soon as the economy will improve. which will immediately recreate the same problems. So much energy and matter are involved in the present civilization collapse that we can make some valid predictions concerning our future, especially if we take into account the lessons of history. For instance, we know that on top of creating mass unemployment, an economic depression produces extreme poverty, hunger, anxiety, and finally riots and looting by the poorest of the poor. That sort of civil unrest can be extremely difficult to control when they occur in large cities or in a capital where it is easy to regroup and organize large crowds of angry people. If such a situation gets out of hand, a revolution can follow if the police and the army no longer trust the government and starts joining the rebellion. That sort of chain reaction has been responsible for the executions of Charles I of England, Louis XVI of France, and Nicholas II of Russia. Once started, a revolution behaves like a tornado and destroys everything in its path, sometimes during years. It only stops when the population gets tired of all the shortages, the suffering, the massacres, and the anarchy it produces. When finally the endless quarrels between the leaders of the revolution have killed enough of them, one of the survivors can easily seize the power by force. After a last round of killings, a dictatorship is established and order is restored. It's rare that foreign powers intervene in such a messy situation if their interests are not threatened. In most cases, they wait to see who's the winner of the civil war, the last man standing, before offering him an alliance. Civil wars are so upsetting for the world order that very few foreigners are rejoicing when they occur. Even if the scenario I just described is historically plausible, we cannot expect to live something similar in the 21st century due to the global nature of our problems. If some bad crops and the indebtedness of the 18th century French government triggered a revolution that set Europe afire for 25 years, you can imagine the extent of the crisis caused by the collapse of almost all the world's ecosystems. Add to it the fact that in 2020 our global debt has reached the staggering amount of 258,000 billion US dollars. We are talking here about 3.3 times the whole world GDP, and that debt keeps growing. Nowadays, many dispersed countries like Syria, Congo, Venezuela, or Brazil with its lawless favelas are no longer under the full control of their governments. In Europe also, anarchy is growing, especially in the suburbs of some Western countries where the clashes between the Islamists and the European far right would quickly become full-blown civil wars if the riot police was not there to keep them separated. In USA also, the situation is worrisome for many reasons. First, because the country is isolated from the rest of the world by two large oceans, which means that during the coming depression, the Americans will have to solve their problems by themselves without any foreign interference. Second, because USA is maybe the only country in the world to have enough resources and reserves to survive a severe economic downturn. Third, because the country is a declining superpower, which shows all the most classic symptoms of what the historians always called decadence. The Americans are extremely indebted. They have huge budget and commercial deficits. They are less and less competitive, etc. What is maybe more important, since the 1960s, their elites have worked very hard to invert all the values defended by their ancestors during centuries. These days, many human rights that the American Constitution is supposed to protect are no longer respected. For instance, the freedom of opinion and the freedom of speech. A new form of moral censorship imposed by some self-appointed and totally anonymous priest has taken the control of the mass media, of the internet, and of the universities. The situation has become so anarchic and unstable that in some cities like New York or Portland, the mayors have decided to defund the police in the vain attempt to remain popular. As a result, the population of many poor neighborhoods is no longer protected. Recently, the Pentagon director behaved like a little Napoleon when he said that he could refuse to obey to an order given by the president-elect, who, according to the American Constitution, is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. Such contempt for the authorities has become so prevalent in the country that riots and looting have become commonplace. In certain cities, some protesters go as far as invading quiet neighborhoods by night to yell insults at their frightened residents. In other words, anarchy is everywhere, especially since the election of a controversial president like Donald Trump. The real problem here is that the American public owns 393 million guns and rifles and at least tens of billions of bullets. Moreover, they are all obsessed by racism and no longer respect other people's rights. In other words, the country has become a powder keg that could easily explode during the coming depression. If the country was to descend into civil war, most of the fighting would occur in the cities, and even the White House would become indefensible, which would force the intervention of the army to restore order. Unfortunately, the army is not equipped with riot gear, but with heavy weaponry. A police state and a left or right-leaning dictator would then seize the power. A dictatorship which, in an old democracy like USA, would almost certainly be reorganized like a pseudo-democracy. That's precisely what Augustus, the first Roman Empire, did at the end of the civil war that ravaged the Greco-Roman world at the end of the 1st century before Christ. Something is certain: the chaos, the misery, the hunger, the destruction, and the multiple wars, civil or not, atomic or not, produced by the coming depression all over the world will speed up the destruction of all our natural environments. That, in turn, will hasten our demographic and economic decline, a decline that will stop only when the remaining natural ecosystems will again be able to absorb all the pollution produced by mankind. I talk about it in much more detail in the book I published on Amazon.ca. Don't bother. Mankind, which is extremely resilient, will easily survive the coming crisis. Individuals will suffer. In the next video, I will talk about the technologies our descendants will probably use to survive the next centuries. As usual, I thank you in advance to share this video on the internet, to give it the thumbs up, to subscribe to my channel, and to help me financially if you can. See you next time.